No one was ever supposed to know this. The story was buried, not in a book, not in a forgotten grave, but in the silence between heartbeats, in the fear of men who saw God and wished they hadn't. It was hidden for over 200 years, a secret carried in blood and soil. Until now. On August 17, 1859, the Savannah auction house on Broughton Street became something other than a marketplace. It became a temple, a place of judgment. The air, usually thick with the metallic tang of fear and sweat, was different that day. It was still, heavy, as if waiting for a verdict. When lot number 43 was brought to the block, a hush fell over the room, so profound you could hear the dust motes settling in the afternoon light. 27 of the wealthiest men in Georgia were there, paddles ready, fortunes built on the backs of others. But as the woman in chains ascended the platform, something ancient and cold coiled through the room. One by one, hands fell, eyes dropped. What power could make masters look away? What secret did they all share? A truth so terrifying it was only ever whispered. A newly wealthy planter from Charleston, Thomas Cornelius Puett, felt the silence but didn't understand its language. He saw a bargain, a piece of property. He didn't see the history standing before him, a history that had already chosen him. He paid $12 for a woman whose soul was not for sale. He thought he was buying a slave. What he brought home was the end of his world. How does a truth this vast vanish from history? And what happens to the man who unearths it? By accident? The gavel's crack was like a bone snapping. For $12, Thomas Puett became the owner of the silence in the room. He owned the averted eyes, the nervous coughs, the sweat on the brows of men who faced down hurricanes but flinched from the gaze of this one woman. Her name, the auctioneer had mumbled, was Celia. He'd listed her skills, midwife, cook, herbalist, in a voice devoid of its usual booming confidence. It was a resume of life-giving talents, yet every man in attendance reacted as if he were selling a plague. After the finality of the sale, as Celia was led away, her eyes met Thomas's for a fleeting, searing moment. There was no defiance in them. No hatred, no fear. There was only assessment. It was the look of an artisan examining a tool, deciding if it was fit for the task ahead. Thomas, flush with the arrogance of new money and the belief that he was a master of his own destiny, dismissed it. He went to the clerk's office to settle his accounts, the woman's unsettling stillness already fading from his mind. The clerk, a man whose face was a roadmap of moral compromises, barely looked up. His pen scratched across the ledger. When Thomas asked about Celia's past, about the Peaton estate she came from, the pen stopped. Just for a second. Liquidated, the clerk said, his voice a dry rasp. After Mr. Peaton's death. He pushed the bill of sale across the desk. Thomas saw the price again. $12. An insult, a warning. The clerk met his eyes then, and Thomas saw it. The same deep, primal fear he'd seen in the auction hall. "It's not my place to question the market, sir," the clerk whispered, as if the walls themselves were listening. Some things are priced according to what they cost you to keep, not what they cost you to buy." The journey to Waverly Plantation was an hour of stifling silence, broken only by the clatter of hooves and the drone of cicadas. Thomas rode ahead, the new master of an 800-acre kingdom of cotton and river marsh. Behind him, in the wagon with the other new purchases, Celia sat as still as a stone effigy. The other slaves huddled together, a mass of shared misery, but she sat apart, a lone figure carved from shadow. She didn't look at the passing fields or the unfamiliar trees. Her gaze was fixed inward, as if she were consulting a map no one else could see. Waverly, when it came into view, was the very picture of Southern ambition, a grand, columned house, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin. It was a place of ghosts, of ambitions that had curdled and died. The previous owner had expired without an heir, a convenient void for Thomas to fill. He saw land, profit, legacy. He did not see the stage. He did not see that the play had already been written, and his role was not the one he imagined. As they arrived, his new overseer, a gaunt man named Hutchkins, began sorting the arrivals. Field hands to the West Barracks, the cook to the main house. But when he came to Celia, he hesitated, his hand hovering in the air as if reluctant to touch her. "Where do you want this one, Mr. Puett?" The question hung in the humid air. She has medical training, Thomas thought. A practical man solving a practical problem. "Put her in the old infirmary cabin. She can assist with the sick." Hutchkins nodded slowly, a deep unease in his eyes. A historical rumor, whispered from one generation of the enslaved to the next, spoke of certain lands. Lands that held memory. They said the soil at places like Waverly never forgot a drop of blood or a single tear. It kept a ledger of its own, and sooner or later it always called for its debts to be paid. Before the dust of his arrival had even settled, a visitor appeared. Josiah Crenshaw, a neighboring planter whose family had owned land in Chatham County since the days of the royal grant. He was old money, his face a mask of casual authority, but his eyes held the weary look of a man who knew too much. They sat on the grand front portico, sipping bourbon that burned its way down Thomas's throat. Crenshaw dispensed with pleasantries quickly. "I saw you at the auction today," he began, his voice low. "A bold purchase, that last one." Thomas felt a prickle of defensiveness. She was a bargain. Skilled workers are hard to come by. Crenshaw swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze distant. "Did you wonder why she was such a bargain? Did it not occur to you to ask why every man in that room, myself included, would rather have set fire to his own fields than bid on her?" The question was an indictment. Thomas felt his ignorance like a brand on his skin. "The Peaton estate," Crenshaw continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know of it, of course. Dr. Harold Peaton, a man of science, they said. A healthy man, until he wasn't." He leaned forward, the folksy charm gone, replaced by something cold and urgent. It wasn't just Peaton. First, it was his physician, a Dr. Vance, died of a fever that came on like a thunderclap. Then his driver, Marcus, found in the stables with his neck snapped. They said a horse kicked him, but Marcus could soothe the devil himself if you put him on 4 legs. After him, the overseer, a brute named Kelly, raving madness for 2 weeks, screaming about shadows in his food, then dead. 4 men, 4 healthy men, all closely associated with the Peaton household, all dead within 2 months. And the only thing they all had in common was her. Thomas felt the bourbon curdle in his stomach. "Coincidence," he managed, the word tasting like a lie. Crenshaw let out a short, bitter laugh. "That's what we told ourselves at first." "It's what you tell yourself when the alternative is unthinkable." But the whispers started. Stories from the Peaton slaves. Stories about why this chain of death began. He set his glass down, the clink of it against the wood as sharp as a final judgment. 6 months ago, Celia's daughter took ill. A girl of 16, pneumonia. Dr. Vance was sent to treat her. Crenshaw paused, his eyes locking onto Thomas's. Celia claimed the doctor was drunk. Claimed he administered the wrong treatment, that he bled the girl when her body was already failing. She said he killed her daughter out of arrogance and neglect. She made accusations, loud ones. The story was painting a picture Thomas didn't want to see, a narrative of justified rage that his entire world was built to deny. Peaton had her whipped for her insolence. Confined her to the old smokehouse for a week to cool her spirit. They say you could hear her from the main house. Not screaming, chanting, words in a language no one knew. 2 weeks after she was released, Dr. Vance was dead. Then Marcus, who held her down for the whipping. Then Kelly, who wielded the lash. And finally, Peaton himself, who gave the order. Crenshaw's voice was barely a whisper now. "That woman doesn't just know herbs that cure, Mr. Pewitt. She comes from a line of them. Women who carry knowledge that goes back across the ocean. She knows what grows in the dark corners of the swamp. She knows what soothes a fever, and what can stop a heart so cleanly the coroner calls it an act of God. You didn't buy a slave today. You bought a judge, a jury, and an executioner with nothing left to lose." That evening, the setting sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of slaughter. Thomas found himself walking towards the small infirmary cabin, a place set apart from the main quarters. He needed to see her, to look into her eyes and find the monster Crenshaw had described, or the victim his own conscience wanted her to be. He found her sitting on a simple cot, her hands resting in her lap, unbound. She was the picture of tranquility, yet the very air in the cabin seemed to vibrate with a low, unseen energy. When she saw him, she rose, not with the deference of a slave, but with the quiet dignity of a host receiving a guest in her own home. Her eyes, those dark, unreadable pools, met his without a flicker of fear. "You are Celia," he said, the words feeling foolish and inadequate. "Yes, master." The title was spoken without inflection, a simple statement of fact, not an acknowledgement of his power. "I'm told you are a healer, a midwife." She inclined her head slightly. I learned from my mother. She learned from hers. The knowledge is carried in the blood. Her candor was disarming. It felt less like a confession and more like a lesson. I am also told, Thomas pressed, his voice tight, that there were many deaths at your previous residence. A long silence stretched between them, thick with the scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The cabin felt like a place outside of his world, governed by different laws. People die, Master, she said at last, her voice soft as moss. It is the one certainty, the great balancing of the world's accounts. The phrase hung in the air, a philosophical statement that felt chillingly specific. He decided to abandon subtlety. Did you kill them, Celia? He expected a denial, a protestation, perhaps even tears. Instead, a faint, slow smile touched her lips, a smile utterly devoid of warmth. Can a prayer kill a man, Master? Can a wish for justice stop a beating heart? I am what you have made me, a slave. I have no power. If God chose to call those men to account for their sins, who am I to question his will? Every life is a debt, every death a payment. It is the oldest law. This quote, attributed to a Gnostic text suppressed in the 4th century, captures the essence of the philosophy Thomas was just beginning to encounter. It wasn't about revenge. It was about cosmic accounting. He left her cabin that night with his certainty shattered. Her denial was more damning than any confession. She had wrapped her guilt, if it existed, in the language of faith, making it untouchable, irrefutable. She had positioned herself not as an actor, but as an instrument of a higher power, a force of nature as inevitable as the tide. He lay in the Master's bed, the fine linens feeling like a shroud, and thought of her words. The great balancing of the world's accounts. It was a worldview that terrified him because, in its own dark way, it made perfect sense. The world he inhabited, the system that gave him his wealth and power, was built on a staggering imbalance. What if she was simply the corrective force it had inevitably created? What if the cruelty of men like Peyton had summoned its own antibody? He thought of her daughter, dead at 16. He tried to imagine the rage, the profound helplessness of watching a child die because of a man's pride. What would that grief do to a person? What would it do to a woman who possessed a deep and ancient knowledge of life and death, of plants that could either save or condemn? He fell into a troubled sleep, dreaming of scales, perfectly balanced, one side holding a pile of gold coins, the other a single dark feather that outweighed it all. He was beginning to understand that Waverly wasn't just a plantation. It was a crucible, and he was trapped inside it with something he could neither command nor comprehend. If you've come this far on this journey into the dark, comment, the scales demand it below. You're not just watching a story anymore. You are bearing witness. The harvest season arrived with the suffocating fist of late September heat. Ominous, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the horizon, the harbingers of a hurricane brewing in the Atlantic's warm cradle. The cotton, white and ready, was a fortune waiting to be plucked from the earth. A fortune that could be wiped out in a single night of wind and rain. Thomas drove the enslaved workers with a frantic urgency, a desperation shared by every planter in the county. They worked from before sunrise until the last vestiges of light failed them, their bodies moving in a rhythm of pure exhaustion. But Celia was not in the fields. Thomas had assigned her to work with old Patience, the plantation's long-serving healer, a woman whose knowledge was based on folk remedies and superstition. He'd hoped Patience would supervise, perhaps even contain, Celia's influence. Within a week, the opposite had happened. Hutchkins, the overseer, reported it with a grudging respect. Patience, says the new woman. She knows things. Things Patience has never seen. Remedies for ailments we've always just accepted as fate. He explained that Celia had requested a small plot of land behind the infirmary to start a proper herb garden. Thomas agreed, thinking it a harmless concession. He saw it as a way to improve the health of his workforce, a sound financial decision. He didn't see it for what it was, the establishment of an armory. The garden grew with unnatural speed, comfrey for wounds, feverfew for fevers, willow bark for pain. Each plant was tended with a reverence that bordered on worship. Celia kept a journal, not just of what she planted, but of the phases of the moon, the patterns of the stars. It was not agriculture. It was alchemy, the art of turning the earth's secrets into power. The hurricane hit on October 12th. It wasn't just a storm. It was a siege. For 18 hours, the world was reduced to the shriek of the wind and the percussive roar of the rain. Trees that had stood for a century were bent to the ground like supplicants. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a landscape of devastation. A fifth of the cotton was lost, beaten into the mud. The roof of one of the slave quarters had been torn clean off. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and ruin. But the storm was only the beginning. 2 days later, the sickness came. It started with the children, a fever that burned hot and fast, accompanied by a deep, rattling cough. Then it moved to the adults, felling the strongest field hands as easily as the old and frail. Within a week, 23 people were sick, their moans filling the damp, crowded cabins. Panic began to take root, a fear more corrosive than the storm itself. Thomas sent for a doctor from Savannah, a young man whose confidence was quickly overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. He diagnosed it as a lung fever, brought on by the damp and chill. He prescribed the standard treatments of the day: calomel, a toxic mercury compound, and rest. "Keep them warm," he said, his eyes avoiding the desperate faces around him. "The fever should break in a few days." After the doctor departed, his carriage wheels churning through the mud, Thomas found Celia in the makeshift infirmary. She was moving with a calm, methodical grace amidst the chaos, her presence a strange anchor in the storm of sickness. She was not following the doctor's orders. She was ignoring them completely. Thomas confronted her, his voice sharp with the anxiety of a man losing control. "The doctor prescribed calomel. Are you administering it?" Celia didn't even look up from the poultice she was preparing. She was grinding herbs in a mortar, the pestle rising and falling in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. "Calomel is a poison," she said, her voice flat. "It will weaken them faster than the fever." The doctor is a fool who reads books but doesn't understand bodies. The sheer audacity of her statement, the casual dismissal of educated white authority, left Thomas momentarily speechless. This was more than insubordination. It was a declaration of a different power, a different truth. "He is a licensed physician," Thomas insisted, feeling the need to defend the world he understood. "And his medicine will kill more of your workers than this fever ever could," she countered, finally looking up at him. Her eyes were not angry. They were filled with a weary certainty. "You want these people to work your fields to make you rich. To do that, they must live. The doctor's way leads to the graveyard. My way leads back to the fields. The choice is yours, master." It should have been an easy decision. He should have asserted his authority, forced her to comply, punished her for her defiance. But he looked at the sick, at the rising tide of death that threatened to swallow his investment, and then he looked at her. He saw not a slave, but a commander on a battlefield, utterly confident in her strategy. "What would you do differently?" he asked, and in that moment, the master-slave dynamic between them fractured, perhaps forever. "No calomel," she stated. "Willow bark tea to break the fever. A syrup of honey and garlic to clear the lungs. And most importantly, we separate the sickest. This illness is not in the air. It passes between people. We must contain it." It flew in the face of all conventional medical wisdom. But conventional wisdom was failing. "Do it," he said, the words tasting of surrender. "But if they die, the responsibility is yours." She turned back to her work. "People dying is always someone's responsibility, master. The only question is whose." A surreal, chilling visual from an unrelated 1860s medical journal shows a fever map of a southern county. It's an almost beautiful, abstract drawing of dots and clusters, each dot representing a death. It looks like a constellation, a dark astrology charting the path of an invisible killer. This is the world Thomas now inhabited, a place where life and death were charted not by science, but by the will of one woman. Celia transformed the quarters into a field hospital. She organized the healthy to care for the sick, enforcing a strict regimen of hygiene that was decades ahead of its time. She worked without sleep, her energy seeming to come from some deep, inexhaustible well. She brewed teas in great cauldrons over open fires, the steam carrying strange, earthy aromas through the camp. She spoke to the sick in low, calming tones, sometimes in English, sometimes in that other, older language Thomas had heard of. He watched her, fascinated and terrified. She was not merely treating a disease. She was waging a war. She moved with the authority of a queen in her own court. The enslaved, who had been terrified and lost, now looked to her with a reverence that bordered on worship. They followed her instructions without question. They trusted her. They had seen white medicine fail them time and again. Now, they were seeing something else, something born of their own history, their own suppressed knowledge, and it was working. Within 3 days, the first fevers began to break. Within a week, all but 2 of the afflicted were on the road to recovery, both elderly, their bodies already weakened by years of labor. Under the doctor's care, Thomas knew, the death toll would have been catastrophic. Celia had saved his plantation. She had saved his profits, and in doing so, she had bound him to her with chains far stronger than any made of iron. Word of the miracle at Waverly spread through the county like wildfire. Slaves whispered it to each other over fences and on trips to town. Overseers heard it from their workers. And soon the masters themselves began to talk. The woman Puett had bought for $12, the one they had all shunned, the one they called the Peton Curse. She had single-handedly stopped an outbreak that was now sweeping through neighboring plantations. By early November, Thomas began receiving visitors. Planters he barely knew, men who had avoided him since the auction, now arrived at his door, hats in hand. Their polite inquiries about his crop yields were a thin veneer over their real purpose. They wanted to borrow Celia, to rent her skills. At first it was for yellow fever at the Mansfield estate, then a difficult childbirth at the Rutledge place, a mysterious wasting sickness near the Ogeechee River. In each case, Thomas agreed. It was good for neighborly relations, and the fees they offered were substantial. Celia was dispatched like a visiting physician, sometimes for a day, sometimes for a week, and everywhere she went she succeeded. Fevers broke, babies were born healthy, the dying rallied. Her reputation grew, transforming from something dark and feared into something miraculous and sought after. She was no longer Celia the Curse. She was Celia the Healer, but Thomas knew the truth. Healing and killing were 2 sides of the same coin. The knowledge required for one was the knowledge required for the other. As he deposited the fees into his bank account in Savannah, he felt a growing dread. He wasn't just profiting from her skill. He was laundering her reputation. He was helping her build a network, an empire of obligation and dependency that stretched across the entire county. He was making her untouchable. Reputation is a dangerous currency. For a woman like Celia, it was both a shield and a target. As people celebrated her cures, they also began to remember the deaths that had first made her infamous. They started to connect the two. How could someone know so much about saving a life without also knowing, with equal intimacy, how to take one? The whispers returned, different this time. Less fearful, more awestruck. They said she could walk through a field and name every plant that could kill a man, and every plant that could save him. They said she didn't just heal the body, she could see the sickness in a person's soul. Thomas heard the rumors, but chose to ignore them. He was in too deep. Celia had been nothing but a model of efficiency and skill. She had saved his workforce, stabilized his plantation, and was now a significant source of income. Whatever had happened at the Peton estate was in the past. Waverly was a clean slate. He repeated this to himself so often it almost felt true. That was when the first sign appeared. It was a cold Tuesday morning in December when Hutchkins, the overseer, came running to the main house, his face the color of ash. "You need to come, sir, now." A crowd of the enslaved had gathered near the northern wall of the quarters. They parted silently as Thomas approached, revealing a symbol painted on the wood in a dark reddish-brown substance that looked disturbingly like dried blood. It was a complex geometric design, a circle containing a 7-pointed star with smaller symbols radiating from each point. In the very center was the clear print of a human hand, fingers spread wide. It felt ancient, alien, and radiated a palpable sense of power. "What is this?" Thomas demanded, his voice tight. An old man named Daniel, whose grandmother had been brought over from the old country, stepped forward, his eyes wide with a fear that was almost religious. "It's a warning, master," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's old magic. From before, my grandmother, she spoke of such things. She said signs like this are a notice. They mean someone is working roots, calling on the old powers, and when the signs appear, it means a debt is about to be collected." Thomas stared at the symbol, at the handprint at its center. Whose hand? Whose debt? The questions echoed in the unnerving silence of the crowd. He ordered the symbol washed away immediately and threatened severe punishment for whoever was responsible. But the act was futile. You cannot wash away an idea. You cannot punish a belief. The symbol wasn't for him. It was a message to the community, a declaration that a different law was now in effect on his plantation. Fear, a far more potent master than himself, had taken residence at Waverley. 3 days later, Hutchins's prize-hunting dog, a beast he valued more than most people, was found dead by the well. The dog had been perfectly healthy the night before. Now it lay stiff, its lips curled back in a silent snarl, a white foam crusted around its mouth. "Poison," Hutchins said, his voice hollow. "Something quick, something that leaves no trace." A week before Christmas, the debt came for a human soul. A field worker named Samuel, a man known for his strength and his cruelty to others, suddenly fell ill. It began with stomach cramps so severe they bent him in half. By evening he was vomiting uncontrollably, his body racked with violent convulsions. Celia was summoned. She knelt beside the dying man, but not with her usual healer's touch. She simply observed, her face a mask of detached, clinical interest. When she finally looked at Thomas, her eyes were cold as river stones. "This is no natural sickness," she stated. "He has been poisoned. Poisoned." Thomas felt the world tilt on its axis. The abstract fear he'd been living with had suddenly become terrifyingly concrete. "How? By whom?" Celia rose, wiping her hands on her apron. "There are a dozen plants that grow within a mile of here that could do this. As for who, that is the more difficult question." She looked directly at Thomas, and he felt as if she were reading the darkest corners of his mind. "But perhaps you are asking the wrong question, Master. It is not who gave it to him, it is who taught the giver." Samuel's death was an agonizing spectacle that lasted 3 hours. His screams echoed through the quarters, a sermon of suffering that every man, woman, and child on the plantation was forced to hear. The fear that had been a quiet murmur now became a collective shriek. Thomas launched an investigation, interrogating everyone who had been near Samuel that day. It was a useless exercise. Samuel had eaten from the same communal pot as everyone else. He had drunk from the same well. He had no single obvious enemy. He was cruel to many, and so the list of suspects was impossibly long. But a chilling thought began to form in Thomas's mind, a thought planted by Celia's carefully chosen words. What if Samuel hadn't been the target at all? What if this wasn't about him? What if this was a demonstration, a lesson for the entire community in a new kind of power? A test, perhaps, for one of Celia's students. That night's sleep was impossible. Thomas lay in the Grand Master's bed, a loaded pistol on the nightstand, listening to the night sounds of the plantation. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside his window, sounded like an approaching threat. He had bought a healer to protect his assets. Instead, he had imported a predator who was now teaching the other animals in the zoo how to open their own cages. The Piton estate and its 4 dead men no longer seemed like a distant story. It felt like a prologue. A whispered historical rumor from the era speaks of root doctors and conjure women who formed a secret, powerful network within the slave communities of the South. They were more than just healers. They were the spiritual and judicial authorities of a society forced to exist in the shadows. They passed down knowledge of herbs, of poisons, of human psychology that was a direct inheritance from their African origins. They were the keepers of a power that chains could not bind. Christmas at Waverley was a hollow affair. Thomas distributed the traditional gifts of extra rations and cheap cloth, but the gestures of paternalistic goodwill felt like a mockery. Samuel's horrific death had poisoned the very air. The enslaved accepted their gifts with downcast eyes and muted thanks, their fear a palpable thing, thick and suffocating. They huddled together in their cabins, finding safety in numbers, whispering about the handprint on the wall and the poison that had struck down one of their own. On Christmas evening, a commotion erupted from the quarters. Thomas grabbed his pistol and ran out into the frigid night. A ring of torches illuminated a frantic scene by the well. 2 men were wrestling with a young woman, Ruth, a laundry girl of 19, trying to stop her from throwing herself into the dark, stone-lined shaft. Her eyes were wild, her screams nonsensical. "What is happening?" Thomas demanded, pushing through the crowd. Hutchins met him, his face grim. "She's gone mad, sir. Been this way since sundown. Ranting about voices in her head. Said she had to wash herself clean." Ruth stopped struggling, and her wild eyes found Thomas. In the flickering torchlight, her face was a mask of pure terror. "They're coming for me," she rasped, her voice raw. "The shadows. They have his face. They keep telling me what I did, what I have to do to make it right. The only way to silence them is in the water." The phrase she kept repeating between sobs was, The debts must be paid. The same words Celia had spoken. The same philosophy. Thomas felt a cold that had nothing to do with the December air. And then he saw her, Celia, standing at the edge of the crowd, perfectly still, watching the scene unfold as if it were a play she had seen many times before. As Celia moved forward, the crowd parted for her as if by instinct, a silent acknowledgement of her authority. She knelt before the hysterical girl, her presence immediately calming. "Hush now, child," she said, her voice a low, hypnotic hum. Ruth's panicked eyes focused on Celia, a flicker of desperate recognition in them. You know," she sobbed. "You told me. You told me the Roots would know my heart. Tell them!" "Tell them I didn't mean for him to die." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The confession hung in the frozen air. "I was just so angry," Ruth cried, the words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt. "He hurt me. He had no right to touch me like that. I only wanted him to feel the pain he caused me. I picked the mushrooms you showed me, the ones that bring the stomach cramps. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know they would kill him." Thomas felt the ground drop out from under him. "Ruth," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you saying you poisoned Samuel?" But Ruth wasn't listening to him. Her entire being was focused on Celia, her expression one of desperate, pleading terror. "Make the voices stop," she begged. "The shadows. Please make them go away." Celia placed 2 fingers on the girl's forehead, a gesture that was both tender and ceremonial. "I cannot stop what you have started, child. You opened a door, and now you must walk through it. All I can do is make the journey peaceful." She produced a small, dark bottle from a pocket in her dress. She uncorked it and held it to Ruth's lips. "Drink this," she commanded gently. "It will quiet the shadows. You will sleep, and when you wake, you will be free." Ruth drank without hesitation. Within minutes, her frantic struggles ceased. Her body went limp, her breathing slowed, and her eyes closed. She was carried away to be watched, the crowd dispersing in hushed, fearful whispers. Thomas grabbed Celia's arm before she could melt back into the darkness. "What was in that bottle? What did you just do?" "Valerian root," Celia answered calmly, pulling her arm from his grasp. "And chamomile. Things to soothe a troubled mind." The girl was breaking under the weight of her own guilt. Thomas stared at her, searching for any sign of deception in her placid features. She confessed to murder. She confessed to being a foolish child who played with powers she did not understand. Celia corrected him. She took knowledge that was meant for healing and twisted it into a weapon of revenge. The mushrooms she picked grow right next to the ones that would have only made him sick. It is an easy mistake for a novice. The explanation was plausible. It was neat, and Thomas didn't believe a word of it. The precision of Samuel's death, the psychological torment that followed for Ruth, it felt too perfectly orchestrated to be an accident. It felt like a lesson, taught in the cruelest way imaginable. "You seem to know a great deal about guilt, Celia," Thomas said, his voice laced with accusation. She met his gaze in the torchlight, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something ancient and sorrowful in her eyes. "I know what it does to a person, Master. I know how it can poison the soul more surely than any mushroom. It twists the world until you can no longer tell what is real and what is a shadow of your own making." She held his gaze a moment longer, a silent challenge passing between them. "I also know about justice, about how it finds its way even in the dark, how it balances the scales in ways we don't always expect." She turned and walked away, her form swallowed by the night, leaving Thomas standing by the well. The scene of one confession, and what he was beginning to suspect, was a second, unspoken crime. He was no longer just a planner. He was the warden of an asylum, the owner of a battlefield, and he was beginning to realize he had no authority here at all. The real power on Waverly Plantation was wielded by a woman who could kill with a mushroom and calm with a whisper. Ruth died 2 days later in her sleep. She never woke from the deep slumber Celia's potion had induced. Her breathing simply stopped. Celia examined the body and declared the cause to be a failure of the heart, brought on by the immense strain of her guilt and madness. The official story was that a troubled girl had found a tragic peace, but the whispers in the quarters told a different tale. They said Celia hadn't given Ruth a sleeping draught. She had given her a merciful release, an exit from a life that had become an agony. Thomas didn't know what to believe, and the not knowing was a kind of madness in itself. Ruth's confession should have been the end of the mystery, but it had only deepened it. How had an uneducated laundry girl learned to identify potent plant toxins? Where had this sudden deadly knowledge come from? The answer, he realized, had been in front of him all along. He started to watch Celia, not as a master observing a slave, but as an apprentice studying a master. She was more than a healer. She was a teacher. He saw the quiet way other women on the plantation now deferred to her. He saw them meeting with her in her herb garden, their heads bent together in quiet consultation. He saw women who had once been meek and broken now carry themselves with a new, unsettling confidence. They were an order, a sisterhood, and Celia was their high priestess. She was disseminating her knowledge, her philosophy of balance and retribution, creating a network of acolytes right under his nose. Ruth had been one of them, her first failed student. During a bitter ice storm in January that locked the plantation down, Thomas finally did what he should have done months ago. He used his master key and let himself into Celia's cabin while she was tending to Hutchkins's ailing wife. The cabin was a laboratory, a pharmacy, a sanctuary. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling in carefully labeled bundles, filling the air with a complex, earthy perfume. On shelves, dozens of glass bottles and clay jars held powders, oils, and tinctures. But it was what he found under her cot that stopped his heart. A heavy wooden box, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, there were notebooks. Page after page was filled with her elegant script. Most of it was medical notes, dosages, symptoms, treatments. But between the clinical observations were other entries, written in a different, more personal tone. His hands trembled as he read one. October 15th. The sickness is a fire. I am the one who decides whether to quench it or let it burn. 23 fell ill. I chose to save 21. They believe my knowledge belongs to them, a tool for their profit. They are wrong. Knowledge cannot be owned. It can only be shared with the worthy or withheld from the undeserving. Every life I save is a weight on my side of the scale. It is a credit I will spend when justice requires it. It was a ledger, a moral account book. Celia wasn't just healing, she was judging. She was deciding who was worthy of life and who was not. He flipped through the pages, his horror growing. Another entry, dated just before Christmas. The girl, R, came to me. Her spirit was wounded by the man, S. She asked for justice. I gave her knowledge, as I give to all who are worthy. The choice of how to use it was her own, but I also gave her another seed, planted with a whisper. Guilt. It is a slower poison, but far more certain. It devours the soul from within. Her suffering will be a lesson to the others. Her death will be a mercy. Thomas felt sick. Celia hadn't just taught Ruth how to kill. She had orchestrated her psychological collapse and then euthanized her, all as part of some grand, horrific lesson for her other students. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a separate piece of cloth, he found a single sheet of paper, yellowed and fragile with age. The handwriting was different, older, but the spirit behind it was the same. It was a letter. My dearest daughter, it began. If you read this, I am gone, and the knowledge now rests with you alone. Remember this above all, the plants are not good or evil, they are merely power. It is we, the keepers, who decide their purpose. Use them to heal when the world is in balance. Use them to punish when the scales have been tipped by the cruelty of men. But always, always keep the ledger. Every life saved, every debt collected. This is our sacred duty and our terrible burden. They call us slaves, but they are the ones in chains, bound by their own greed and ignorance. Our knowledge makes us free in a way they can never comprehend. We are the memory of the earth itself, and the earth always, always reclaims what it is owed. It was signed, Phoebe, and dated 1838. It was a scripture, the founding document of their secret religion, a religion of justice, passed from mother to daughter, a legacy of power hidden in plain sight. Thomas heard footsteps outside. He shoved the notebooks back in the box and slid it under the cot just as Celia entered. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes sweeping from his face to the cot to the disturbed dust on the floor. She knew. She simply stood there, her expression unreadable. and then spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm. "Hutchins's wife is failing. The end is near. He will need a new overseer soon. I would recommend Daniel. The men respect him." The casual way she spoke of a future without Hutchins, the matter-of-fact certainty of it, was more terrifying than any threat. She wasn't just predicting the future, she was writing it. "You've been through my things," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have," Thomas admitted, his voice hoarse. There was no point in lying. The truth was a tangible thing between them in that small room. "I know what you did. To the men at the Plantation estate, to Samuel, to Ruth." She moved to the simple cot and sat, a profound weariness in her posture. When she spoke, her voice was stripped of all its mystery, leaving only the raw sound of a grief that had never healed. "My daughter's name was Sarah," she began, and for the first time, Thomas saw tears shimmering in her eyes. "She was 17. She loved the color yellow and the taste of wild honey. Dr. Vance, the man who killed her, smelled of whiskey and arrogance. He ordered her bled. I begged him not to. I told him her body needed to keep its strength to fight the fever. He said my nigger superstitions were of no consequence. He had me whipped for daring to question a white man of science." Her hands clenched into fists in her lap, the knuckles white. "They tied me to a post in the barn. I could hear her calling for me for 3 days. I heard her die, and all I could do was listen." The story, told so simply, was more devastating than anything Crenshaw had said. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, and the words were utterly inadequate. "Sorry doesn't balance the scales," she replied, her voice hardening again. "So I did what my mother taught me to do. I made the scales balance. Dr. Vance died of a heart weakened by small daily doses of foxglove in his tea. Marcus, who helped hold me, died because he couldn't see the spooked horse in the dark stable. Kelly, who held the whip, died from the madness brought on by a fungus I cultivated on his bread. And Peyton died because he was the master of it all. Because his world allowed my daughter to die while I listened." She stood and faced him, her sorrow replaced by a fearsome, righteous anger. "I am not sorry for any of it. They were debts, and I am a faithful collector. I have also saved 21 lives on this plantation," she continued, her voice ringing with an authority that defied her station. "I have delivered 17 healthy babies since my arrival. I ease the suffering of the old and comfort the dying. Am I a murderer, or am I a healer? Or is it possible, Master, that in a world as broken as this one, you cannot be one without being the other?" Thomas felt trapped in a vortex of her logic. She was both, a monster and a savior, and he, by his inaction, was becoming her accomplice. "And what about Hutchins's wife?" he pressed, needing to understand the present danger. "Is she on your ledger too?" Celia's face was a blank canvas. "Everyone's time comes, Master. Hutchins was the overseer at the Plantation estate before he came here. He was the man who tied the knot that held me to that post." Thomas felt his blood run cold. Hutchins, his loyal, efficient overseer, was a dead man walking, and his wife's slow, agonizing death was part of the punishment, a way to make Hutchins suffer just as Celia had suffered. "This is not justice," Thomas said, his voice shaking. This is a plague." "Justice is a plague to those who are guilty," she countered. "To the innocent, it is a cool drink of water." The cabin felt like a courtroom, and he was being judged. He realized with a sickening lurch that he stood at a precipice. He could expose her. But how? Her journal was her word against his. There was no proof, and if he tried and failed, what would happen to him? What would happen to his plantation without its healer? "What happens now?" he asked, the question a plea. "That," she said, moving towards the door, "depends entirely on you. You can fight me, or you can accept that my justice is the only justice this place will ever know. Your profits will be higher, your workers healthier. All it costs is your silence. All it costs is the lives of men who, if you were truly honest with yourself, you would admit deserve to die." "And what if I am one of those men?" Thomas asked, the question escaping his lips before he could stop it. "What if I end up on your ledger?" Celia paused in the doorway. her silhouette framed against the dying light. She turned her head slightly, considering him. "Are you a guilty man, Master? Have you killed a child through your pride? Have you taken pleasure in the suffering of others?" "I do not punish the innocent. I only balance the scales." The assurance was anything but reassuring. By the standards of his society, he was a decent master. But in her moral universe, did his very ownership of other human beings make him guilty beyond redemption? As if reading his thoughts, she added one last chilling detail. "The previous owner of Waverly, the man whose convenient death allowed you to buy this place so cheaply. Did you ever wonder about him?" "Natural causes," Thomas said, his mouth suddenly dry. "That's what the deed said." "It was," she affirmed. "His heart simply gave up. I was not here. I had nothing to do with it. But I knew he was dying." Word travels. "I knew this plantation would be sold to a young, ambitious man from Charleston who didn't know the whispers of this county. I knew you would need a healer." He stared at her, the full, terrifying scope of her plan revealing itself. "The auction. The low price. I made myself a curse," she said, a flicker of pride in her voice. "I let the stories of the Peaton estate spread. I made sure every planter in that room was too afraid to bid on me. Except for you, the outsider. I needed to come to Waverly. I chose you to bring me here." It wasn't a series of events. It was a strategy, a campaign. She hadn't been sold to him. She had recruited him. "You've been manipulating me from the very beginning," he breathed, a mixture of awe and terror rising in his chest. She gave him that same faint, unnerving smile. "We all use the tools we are given, Master. You use whips and laws and bills of sale. I use knowledge and fear and the quiet turning of the human heart. You are not supposed to know this, but hidden within the Gullah Geechee communities of the Low Country, there are still whispers of the keepers, women who trace their lineage back, not through names on a bill of sale, but through a chain of passed-down knowledge. A knowledge of the old ways, of the earth's power, of a justice that operates outside of man's law." Thomas felt the power dynamic shift, not like a subtle tremor, but like a seismic, world-altering quake. He was the master of Waverly in name only. The true authority belonged to the woman he had purchased for $12. She controlled life and death. She controlled the loyalty and fear of his workforce. And now, she controlled him. "I could sell you," he threatened, the words feeling weak and hollow even as he spoke them. "You could try," she agreed. "But who would buy me now that the stories are everywhere? And what would happen to your plantation in the next fever outbreak? In the next difficult birth? How many would die? How much profit would you lose?" She had made herself indispensable. It was the ultimate form of power. Not the power to command, but the power to be essential. She had woven herself so deeply into the fabric of his life and his business that to remove her would be to unravel everything. "So what do you want from me?" he asked, the question a final act of surrender. "Nothing you are not already providing," she answered. "A place to work, access to my garden, and your silence, your willingness to look the other way when the scales require balancing. Do not ask questions you do not truly want the answers to. Let nature take its course, even when nature has a helping hand." He was being asked to become a willing accomplice to murder, to sanction her secret reign of terror. "Get out," he said, his voice low and defeated. "Leave me," Celia nodded, accepting his dismissal as the terrified retreat it was. Before she stepped out, she turned back one last time. "Hutchkins will break after his wife dies. The guilt will consume him. You'll need a new overseer. Daniel is the right choice." And with that final, chilling prophecy, she was gone. Thomas did not fight her. He did not sell her. He did not go to the sheriff. He did nothing. He told himself it was pragmatism, that he was protecting his plantation, his investment. But in the long, silent hours of the night, as he lay awake listening for footsteps that never came, he admitted the truth to himself. He was afraid. He was paralyzed by a fear so profound it had reshaped his reality. He was afraid of what she would do to him if he crossed her. He was afraid of the chaos that would ensue if her healing hand were removed. And most terrifyingly of all, he was afraid that on some deep, suppressed level, he agreed with her. Her justice was brutal, but the system she was fighting was just as brutal in its own quiet, legal, daily way. Hutchkins's wife died 7 days later. She faded like a photograph left in the sun, a slow, gentle decline that Celia attended to with what appeared to be the utmost care. Hutchkins, as she had predicted, shattered. The once proud, disciplined overseer became a ghost, his eyes haunted by a grief that was intertwined with a deeper, older guilt. He began to drink, a slow, determined slide into oblivion. By February, Thomas had no choice but to replace him. He promoted Daniel, just as Celia had instructed. And just as she had predicted, Daniel proved to be a far more effective leader, governing by respect rather than fear. Production on the plantation actually increased. Celia's influence, meanwhile, expanded beyond the borders of Waverly. Her medical practice became a regional phenomenon. Women, both enslaved and free, began to make pilgrimages to her cabin, seeking cures for ailments of the body and the spirit. Thomas became the unwilling administrator of this strange enterprise, collecting the fees, recording them in his ledger, and becoming ever more deeply entangled in her web. He was profiting from her power, and that profit was the price of his soul. In late March, the past came calling. A man arrived at Waverly, his clothes and horse speaking of Charleston wealth. His name was Robert Peaton. He was the nephew of the late Dr. Harold Peaton, and he had come for Celia. Thomas received him in the parlor, the air thick with unspoken tensions. Peaton refused the offer of a drink. He was not there for social niceties. "I know you own the woman, Celia," he said, his voice tight with a cold fury. "I am here to buy her. I will pay you 5 times what you paid." Thomas felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in his gut. "She is not for sale." "Not for sale?" Peaton laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Do you have any idea what you are harboring in this house? That woman is a serpent. She murdered my uncle. She murdered his physician, his driver, his overseer. I have no proof that a court would accept, but I know it. I know it in my bones." "Those are dangerous accusations," Thomas said, his own words feeling like a betrayal of what he knew to be true. "Dangerous?" Peaton shot back, his eyes blazing. "The danger is in your ignorance. I've been investigating. I know about the fever outbreak you had, and how she miraculously saved everyone. I know about your field hand who was mysteriously poisoned. I know about the girl who went mad and killed herself. And I know your overseer's wife just died of a convenient, untraceable wasting sickness. Are you seeing the pattern yet, Mr. Pewitt? Or are you determined to be the last one to die?" The words laid out so starkly were a mirror reflecting Thomas's own deepest fears. It was a pattern, a clear, undeniable, terrifying pattern, but to admit it to this man would be to admit his own complicity, his own weakness. "Celia is the finest healer in this county," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I am not selling her." Peaton stared at him, his fury slowly giving way to a look of pity. "You fool!" "My uncle was a fool too. He thought he could control her. Now he's dead. You are dancing with the devil, and you don't even hear the music." After Peaton left, Thomas stood on the portico, the man's warning echoing in his ears. "You are dancing with the devil." He felt a desperate need to believe Peaton was wrong, that he was just a grieving man looking for a scapegoat. But he knew better. That evening he locked himself in his study and did what Peaton's visit had forced him to do. He went through the plantation records, through his own memory, and he made a list. Samuel poisoned, Ruth driven to madness and suicide. Hutchkins' wife faded away under Celia's care. Hutchkins himself, now a ghost waiting for the grave. And there were others he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. An old field hand, dead in his sleep, though he'd been healthy the day before. A house servant who had fallen down the stairs, breaking her neck just 2 days after she had complained to Thomas that Celia frightened her. It was a ledger of death, written in the invisible ink of his own willful ignorance. Against that, he weighed the other side of the scales. The 21 lives saved from the fever, the dozens of healthy babies delivered, the countless fevers, infections, and injuries she had cured. Her ledger was perfectly horrifyingly balanced. Life for life, death for death. The question that kept him awake that night, the question that pounded in his skull, was where did he fall on her scales? Was he an asset to be protected, or was he a debt to be collected? He began to take precautions. He ate only what he saw prepared. He barred his bedroom door at night. He never turned his back on her. He became a prisoner in his own home, a king living in fear of his most powerful subject. His precautions did not go unnoticed. One morning in April, he found a small bundle on his doorstep. Inside were dried herbs and a note in her familiar script. "For the tension in your shoulders, master. A tea to help you sleep. As long as you remain a just man, you have nothing to fear from my garden. The message was a hand of silk stroking a razor's edge. I know you're afraid. I am watching you, and your life is conditional. He threw the herbs in the fire and watched them burn, but he couldn't burn away the fear. The power dynamic had shifted completely. He was no longer her master. He was her subject. His life was a privilege she granted him day by day. In early May, Hutchkins completed his slow suicide, found dead in his cabin with an empty bottle of laudanum beside him, a bottle Thomas recognized as one Celia had prepared for his wife. Had she given it to him? Did it matter? In Celia's world, a guilty man had met his deserved end. The method was irrelevant. The balance was all that mattered. Life on the plantation continued. The cotton grew. The sun rose and set. But beneath the placid surface of routine, a revolution was taking place. A transfer of power, silent and absolute. Thomas felt the ground beneath him turning to quicksand. His moral compass, once so fixed and certain, now spun wildly. He was an accomplice. He was a beneficiary. He was a hostage. He was a student, learning a new and terrifying catechism. One day, Josiah Crenshaw returned. He looked 10 years older. She's building an army, Crenshaw said, his voice a strained whisper. It's not just her anymore. It's happening on my plantation, on a dozen others. The women are meeting in secret. They're sharing her knowledge. One of my own girls looked me in the eye and said, "The old ways are coming back, Master. Best you remember that." What am I supposed to do with that? Thomas looked at the terrified man and heard himself say the unthinkable. Have you considered that perhaps we deserve it? Crenshaw stared at him, his face a mask of horror. My God, she's gotten to you. She's gotten inside your head. Thomas tried to explain. He spoke of the lives she had saved, of the balance, of a justice for the unjusticiable. But the words tasted like ash in his mouth. That's not justice, Pewitt, Crenshaw said, his voice filled with disgust. That's moral rot. He left Thomas alone on the portico to reckon with the terrifying truth of his own transformation. In the suffocating heat of June, Celia came to him. It was the first time she had sought him out since the night he had searched her cabin. She sat in his study, a queen holding court in the house of her vassal. A man is coming tomorrow, she said, her voice calm and even. Benjamin Lell, you will remember him from the auction. He was one of the men who looked away. Thomas remembered. His daughter is dying, Celia continued. She is 17, the same age as my Sarah. He is desperate. He will beg you to command me to heal her. Her eyes locked on his, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. And you will not, she said. It was not a request. It was an order. You see, Mr. Lell was a guest at the Peaton estate the day they whipped me. He stood on the veranda and watched. He heard my daughter crying. And he did nothing. He looked away. Tomorrow, I am going to make him understand what it feels like to be helpless. To watch your child slip away while someone with the power to save them simply chooses not to. It was monstrous. It was a refinement of cruelty Thomas could barely comprehend. And then? He asked, his voice a dry croak. Then, after he has felt that, after he has been stripped of his pride and his power, I will consult the scales. Perhaps I will save her. Perhaps I won't. But if you interfere, Master, if you give me that order, you will take his place on the ledger. You will become a debt that must be paid. The choice was his. Intervene, and he would become her enemy. Do nothing, and he would be a willing witness to an act of profound psychological torture, one that might end in the death of an innocent girl. She was not just asking for his silence anymore. She was demanding his participation. He was no longer just an accomplice. He was being initiated. That night, Thomas did not pace. He did not drink. He sat in his study in the dark, the silence of the great house pressing in on him. He felt the weight of generations, the crushing burden of the system he had inherited. The law gave him the right, the duty to command Celia, to force her to save the girl. But her law, the older, more elemental law of blood and tears and balanced scales, demanded he stand aside. What was justice? Was it the blind, impartial application of man-made rules? Rules that had allowed his entire society to be built on a foundation of human suffering? Or was it this other thing, this terrifying, personal, and deeply intimate reckoning? Was it wrong to make a man feel the same pain he had allowed another to suffer? He had no answers. By the time the sun rose, he had only a single weary certainty. He was no longer the master of this world. He was just a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own authority. When Benjamin Lell arrived, a man broken by fear and grief, Thomas looked at him and saw the face of his own moral cowardice. Lell begged, he pleaded, he offered a fortune. Thomas listened, and then he spoke the words that sealed his fate. "I cannot command her," he said, the lie feeling more true than anything he had ever known. "She is not a tool to be wielded. If you want her help, you must ask her yourself, and you must accept her judgment." He had done it. He had chosen. He had sided not with the laws of Georgia, but with the laws of Celia. He had stepped fully into her world. There was no going back. Celia arrived and listened to Lell's frantic, sobbing pleas. And then she held up a hand, silencing him. She made him recount in excruciating detail the day he had stood by and watched her suffer. She made him remember the sound of the whip, the sound of her daughter's cries, the sight of his own inaction. She stripped him bare, layer by layer, until he was nothing but a vessel of pure, unadulterated guilt. And then, at the very moment Thomas expected her to deliver the final, killing blow, to tell him his daughter would die, she did the unexpected. "Take me to her," she said softly. "I will see what can be done." In that moment, Thomas finally understood. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about re-education. She hadn't wanted to kill Lell's daughter. She had wanted to kill the man Lell used to be. She wanted to remake him, to force him to be reborn through an agony of conscience. She was not just a judge and executioner. She was a god, reshaping the souls of men. She healed the girl. But she told Lell that his debt was not paid. The price for his daughter's life was that for the rest of his days he would never ever again look away when he saw injustice. That was the payment she demanded. A world changed, one soul at a time. After that day, Thomas saw everything differently. He saw the quiet dignity in his workers not as obedience, but as patience. He saw the coming war not as a political conflict, but as a great bloody balancing of the scales. And he saw Celia not as a slave, or a healer, or a murderer, but as a force of history itself. A history that had been suppressed, but that was now rising, demanding to be heard. In the autumn, with the cotton harvested and the world poised on the brink of war, Thomas called Celia to his study. "I am freeing you," he said. The words felt small, absurd. "How do you free someone who was never captive?" "I am filing the manumission papers. You will be, legally, your own woman." She studied him, her gaze as penetrating as ever. "Why?" she asked. "Because it is the only thing left for me to do," he answered, the truth of it settling in his bones. "It is my own attempt to balance a scale. It is not enough, but it is what I have." She gave him a slow, genuine smile, a smile of warmth that he had never seen before. "You have learned, master," she said, "enough to survive what is coming." He watched her walk out of his study, a free woman. But he knew the truth. He was the one who had been emancipated, freed from the burden of a mastery he had never truly possessed, freed from a system he now understood was a moral poison. He was the legal owner of Waverly, but he was merely a caretaker now, a steward for a community that governed itself by a different, older set of laws. He had bought a slave for $12, and in return she had bought his soul, stripped it down to its foundations, and then, in an act of unfathomable mercy, had given it back to him, changed forever. The truth is never really buried. It just waits. It waits in the soil, in the blood, in the memory of the keepers. It waits for someone to stumble upon it. It waits for a story to be told, a story that changes not just how we see the past, but how we understand the very nature of power, justice, and the debts that we all, sooner or later, must pay. Now you know.